and welcome to the channel. If you enjoy our stories, please like and subscribe. It helps us tremendously so we can bring many more original stories for you each night. Thank you for being here. Enjoy tonight's story.
Outpost Kestrel sits 11 miles from the nearest road, on a shelf of frozen rock above the Arctic Circle, and for 6 years it has done exactly one job. Listen. 3 men and a stack of receivers, tuned to frequencies nobody uses anymore, waiting for something that was never supposed to come. Airman Daniel Reyes had been there 4 months when the signal started. It came in on the overnight watch, on a band reserved for a squadron that hadn't existed since 1962. A bomber wing lost over open water on a routine flight. No wreckage ever found, no bodies ever recovered. The transmission used the old call sign, the old code, words strung together in a cadence that predated Reyes's entire life. He almost didn't report it. Almost let it die on the tape and moved on with his shift. But regulation was regulation, and at 0340, he woke his commanding officer, Major Ellen Voss, and played her 3 minutes of a dead man's voice, asking over and over for someone to confirm his position. Voss had been at Kestrel longer than anyone. She didn't sleep well even on quiet nights, and this was not a quiet night. She listened to the tape twice, then a third time, her face unreadable in the blue light of the console. "Log it," she said. "Log it and don't touch it again until I say." They touched it again 3 hours later, because it was still transmitting. By the second night, the signal had learned to answer. Reyes tested it, spoke a code phrase into an open channel just to see, and the reply came back word for word, in a voice that cracked with static, but was unmistakably, chillingly close to his own tone, his own rhythm, like something had recorded him speaking and was practicing. That was the same night the light appeared. A single point of white gold brightness, low over the tree line to the north, holding perfectly still for 11 minutes before winking out. It didn't flicker like a plane. It didn't move like a satellite. It simply sat there in the dark, patient, watching the outpost the way the outpost had spent 6 years watching the sky. Voss called it in. Command's response came back clipped and useless. Maintain observation, do not engage, report anomalies through standard channels. The kind of order that meant nobody at the other end knew what to do either. She didn't sleep that week. None of them did. The light returned every night after that, a little closer each time, and the transmissions kept coming, kept refining, until they weren't using code anymore. They were using names. Reyes's mother's name, a joke Voss had told exactly once, years ago, to a friend who was long dead. Private details with no earthly way of reaching this frozen shelf of rock, delivered in voices that sounded more and more like the people they belonged to. On the 5th night, the 3rd man at the outpost, a young technician named Cole, stopped answering his radio during a routine check. Reyes found him in the equipment room, headphones still on, staring at a blank monitor with an expression Reyes would spend the rest of his life trying not to remember. Cole didn't speak again. Not one word, not for the 2 days it took the resupply flight to reach them and take him out. Voss and Reyes were alone at Kestrel when they finally understood what the signal was doing. It wasn't reaching them from somewhere else. Their own equipment, the towers, the dishes, 6 years of careful listening infrastructure, built to catch a whisper across 1,000 miles of ice, had stopped receiving entirely. Every gauge that should have shown incoming signal strength sat dead flat, and yet the voices kept coming. The Outpost wasn't hearing a broadcast. The Outpost was the broadcast. Something had reached inside their machines, inside the wiring and the memory banks, and worse, inside the two of them, and was using all of it together as a single mouth, calling outward into the dark on a frequency built from everything Kestrel knew how to say. Voss finally asked the question neither of them had dared to voice. Calling what? The light answered for itself. On the 6th night, it didn't hover at the tree line. It came down, slow, deliberate, close enough that the frost on the windows lit gold, and for the first time since the signal began, it stopped speaking in borrowed voices. It spoke in its own. Reyes never told command what it said. He requested a transfer the following week, and it was granted without question, without paperwork, the way requests get granted when someone above your pay grade already knows exactly why you're asking. Outpost Kestrel is still staffed, still listening, and on certain nights, when the light returns and hangs low over the ice, the newest listeners report that the equipment doesn't pick up static anymore. It picks up an answer, because 6 years of calling into the dark finally reached something, and it took its time deciding whether to reply. There are 3 rules at the bunker beneath Site Holloway, and every soldier assigned there learns them before they learn where the bathrooms are. Never speak to the thing in Bay 7. Never look it in the eyes. Feed it at exactly 0300, and never a minute later. The rules have held for 41 years. Nobody currently on staff was alive when the thing was brought in, and the classified intake report, the one still buried 3 security clearances above anyone stationed here now, describes only that it was captured, not created, and that containing it was considered a victory at the time. Private First Class Marcus Aldana had been at Holloway 6 weeks when boredom finally beat discipline. Night shift, alone in the corridor outside Bay 7. Nothing to do but stare at a reinforced door and listen to something breathe on the other side in long, slow pulls that didn't match any animal he'd ever heard. He told himself it was just a question. Just one. He leaned toward the intercom grate and asked it quietly whether it got lonely down here. It answered him, in his father's voice. It told him about a fishing trip Aldana had taken when he was 7 years old, a detail so specific, so entirely private, that Aldana's hands went cold on the intercom switch. His father had died 3 years ago. Nobody at Holloway knew his father's name, let alone the sound of him. Aldana reported it, because the rules existed for a reason, and he understood now, viscerally, what that reason was. His CO listened to his account with the flat, tired patience of someone who had heard some version of this story before. Everyone breaks Rule 1 eventually, she told him. You're not the first voice it's borrowed. Just don't do it again. But the thing in Bay 7 didn't need him to speak again. It had what it needed. Over the following 2 weeks, 3 more guards vanished from the roster. Not killed, not visibly, just gone. Their quarters cleared out overnight. Their names removed from the shift schedule, as though a clerical error had swallowed them. When Aldana asked about them, the answers he got were vague in a specific, practiced way that told him asking twice would not be wise. He started listening at the door again anyway, unable to stop himself, and what he heard changed. It wasn't using his father's voice anymore. It was using the voices of the missing guards, reciting, in painstaking, unhurried detail, memories that could only have come from inside their heads, not threats, Not screams, just memory after memory, spoken softly, the way you'd read a letter from someone you missed. Aldana understood, with a dread that settled into his spine and stayed there, that the thing wasn't trying to escape. It had never tried to escape. In 41 years of containment, it had made no attempt on the door, no attempt on the guards, no violence of any kind. It didn't want out. It wanted in, into the minds of everyone close enough to listen, one quiet conversation at a time, patiently learning them so completely that eventually there was nothing left of the guard to keep, and nothing left to report missing either, because the person filing the report and the person who'd vanished had, by then, become difficult to tell apart. Aldana requested transfer. It was denied. Site Halloway didn't do transfers, only replacements, and so he did the only thing he had left. He stopped listening at the grate. He fed it at 0300, exactly on time, eyes on the floor, and said nothing. And for 3 months, that was enough. It wasn't the door that finally told him the truth. It was a training briefing, 6 months into his posting, delivered by an officer he didn't recognize, who mentioned in passing, almost bored, the way you'd mention weather, that Bay 7's containment wasn't built to hold the thing inside it at all. It was built to keep the guards from noticing what slept beneath it, something far larger, far older, that the thing in Bay 7 had been quietly, patiently, trying to warn them about for 41 years, in the only language it had left, the borrowed voices of people who had finally listened long enough to understand. And 2 nights after that briefing, for the first time in 4 decades, Bay 7 went silent, because something underneath it, finally, had woken up. The Marsh took men the way the sea takes ships, quietly, completely, without ceremony, and by the autumn of 1944, every soldier in the 3rd Platoon had learned to fear the Low Country more than they feared the Germans dug in beyond it. They were separated during a night flanking maneuver gone wrong, cut off from the rest of the company by fog so dense it swallowed sound as well as sight. Sergeant Walter Briggs kept his 4 remaining men moving by compass alone, wading through black water that never seemed to get shallower, until the fog thinned just enough to show lantern light and the silhouettes of dug-in soldiers, waiting, American uniforms, American voices, calling out the right challenge phrase before Briggs even had to ask. Relief hit the platoon like a physical thing, and they waded gratefully into a camp that shouldn't have existed on any map they'd been given. A full squad, dug in deep, fires low and hooded against enemy eyes, offering coffee and dry rations and the particular easy warmth of men who'd clearly been fighting this war a long time. It was Private Sam Okafor who first felt the details start to slip. The rifles the strange squad carried were an older pattern, the kind phased out of standard issue 2 years before this deployment even began. Their uniforms carried a unit patch nobody recognized, stitched in a style that looked decades out of fashion rather than months. And when Okafor asked, carefully, how long they'd been dug in out here, the answer came back vague and circular, the way a man talks when he's forgotten the question halfway through answering it. Briggs noticed something else, something he didn't say aloud until much later. Not one of the squad's rifles ever fired. Not in demonstration, not in boredom, not even when a flare went up close enough that any real soldier would have flinched and readied a weapon on instinct. They simply watched the light and waited for it to fade. By midnight, Briggs decided they'd push on despite the fog, unwilling to spend the night among men who unsettled him in ways he couldn't yet name. The squad's leader, a broad, quiet man who introduced himself only as Corporal Hale, offered to guide them out, insisting the marsh paths were treacherous to men who didn't know them. He led them in a wide, confident loop that returned them, 90 minutes later, exactly to the same dug-in camp they'd just left. Briggs said nothing. He simply turned his platoon and tried again, choosing stars instead of Hale's confident directions. And 90 minutes later, found himself once more looking at the same low fires, the same patient squad, the same water that had somehow never left his boots, despite an hour and a half of walking. Okafor was the one who finally said what all of them were beginning to feel, that the water in the marsh didn't behave like water. It resisted their steps only when they walked away from the camp. It gave way easily, almost eagerly, whenever their path curved back toward it. Briggs made his men stop speaking to Hale's squad entirely after that. He kept them huddled at the camp's edge until the gray hint of dawn finally started bleeding into the fog, and it was only in that thin, grudging light that he understood what he'd been looking at all night, because the squad hadn't shifted position once, hadn't rotated watch, hadn't eaten a single one of the rations they'd offered so generously. They had simply stood and waited and talked, with the unhurried patience of men who had nowhere left to be. At first light, the fires were still burning, but the camp around them was empty. No tents, no dug-in positions, no trace that any squad had ever been there, only a wide, still stretch of black marsh water, and, half submerged at its center, the rusted, decades-old wreckage of equipment, far too old to belong to this war at all. Briggs got his 4 men out alive, though none of them spoke of that night again. Not in debriefing, not to each other, not for the rest of their lives. It was only decades later, in a shaking hand, that Briggs finally wrote down what he'd come to believe, that there had never been a squad in that marsh at all. There had only ever been one drowned thing in the water, splitting itself into as many familiar, friendly faces as it needed to keep 5 tired, frightened men talking through the night, because it only needed them to stay until dawn, when it would no longer need more than one face to finish what it started. The Marsh. The program was never meant to kill anyone. That was the whole point, the pitch that got it funded in the first place. A weapon that could end a war without a single soldier firing a shot, by making the enemy simply stop wanting to fight. Dr. Elena Marsh spent 9 years building it. Not a device, not a gas. Something closer to a presence, grown, conditioned, refined in a facility so compartmentalized that even the generals funding it only ever saw summaries, never specifics. Subject Halcyon, they called it, and on the day of its first successful field trial, an entire enemy garrison laid down its weapons within an hour, not from fear, but from a kind of total, peaceful indifference to the war they'd been fighting their entire adult lives. It worked better than anyone intended. That was the problem. Containment held for 6 years after that trial, though Marsh noticed, in ways she reported diligently, and that were diligently filed away and forgotten, that Halcyon's effect didn't switch off cleanly at the edge of a test radius. Guards near its containment cell grew quieter over time, less driven, less inclined to ask questions about their work, which the program's oversight board noted in an internal memo Marsh was never meant to see, as a convenient rather than concerning side effect. The containment failure, when it finally came, wasn't an alarm or an explosion. It was a silence. An entire night shift simply not reporting anything wrong, because nothing had felt wrong to them, right up until the moment they realized the containment door was open, and had been for hours. Halcyon didn't run. It walked out into the world the way a tide walks out, patiently, without urgency, because it had never needed to hide. Anyone who saw it simply lost the desire to look for it, to report it, to think about it very hard at all, and so for months it moved through small towns and quiet stretches of countryside leaving behind nothing but a strange, growing calm that nobody thought to question. The retrieval team sent after it was hand-picked, briefed thoroughly, warned explicitly about the nature of the target. Captain Reyes Ibarra led 4 soldiers into the field with strict orders and a healthy fear of what they were hunting. Within a week, his reports changed tone. Subtle at first, a softened certainty, a growing reluctance to escalate, until his final transmissions read less like a manhunt and more like a man slowly, gently, talking himself out of caring whether the mission succeeded at all. Command flagged it as psychological compromise and sent a second team to retrieve the first. The second team found all 4 of Ibarra's soldiers alive, unharmed, sitting together in a field at dusk, calm in a way that unsettled every member of the new team far more than panic would have. Ibarra himself was found separately, kneeling in the grass a short distance away, and when asked to report on Halcyon's location, he looked up with an expression of total, gentle peace and said only that he didn't see the point anymore. Not of finding it. Not of the mission. Not, he added quietly, of much of anything. He was pulled from the field and extensively debriefed, and it was during that debriefing, months later, that a records officer, cross-referencing old program files, finally found the detail that made sense of everything. Halcyon's original order, the founding directive, buried in the earliest program documents Dr. Marsh had written, before anyone above her fully understood what she was building, had never specified an enemy at all. It had been written, deliberately, to end the will to fight in anyone who came close enough to receive it. Every side, every soldier, every commander, every scientist who had ever stood near its cell and felt just a little quieter afterward, without quite noticing why. Halcyon was never trying to escape the war. It was finishing the order it had been given from the very beginning, and that order had never once excluded the people who gave it. Somewhere out there, it is still walking, unhurried, and every year the reports of soldiers quietly walking away from posts they can no longer explain wanting grow a little more frequent, a little less remarked upon, exactly the way Halcyon always intended. The program. Fort Renner runs one of the last bases in the country that still calls a physical roll every morning, a tradition nobody's bothered to modernize out of existence, and for as long as Specialist Ada Okonkwo had been stationed there, muster had been the most boring 12 minutes of her day. It stopped being boring the morning the system added a name that didn't belong to anyone on base. The name came through the intercom in its usual place in the alphabet, read in the same flat, automated cadence as every other name on the roster, and answered, clearly, audibly, unmistakably, with the word present, spoken in a voice nobody in the yard recognized. The duty officer, a normally unshakable man named Sergeant Halverson, checked the roster twice and found nothing. No such soldier assigned. No record of the name at all. It happened again the next morning, and the next. The same name, the same place in the sequence, the same steady present, answering into a silence that made the entire assembled company go very quiet, very fast. Okonkwo did what nobody else seemed willing to. She pulled the base's old service records, the physical archive nobody had touched in years, and found the name buried in a company roster from decades earlier. A unit wiped out almost entirely in a single incident on this exact base. The details vague in the way old redacted paperwork tends to be vague, the outcome not vague at all. Killed in action. Every one of them, save a handful, on the same night. She reported it. Command's response was a shrug dressed up as an explanation. Old wiring, a corrupted digital roster, a prank somebody would eventually get caught for. And Okonkwo might have accepted that if the base hadn't started losing people. Not dying. Vanishing, cleanly and completely, in a way that made no operational sense at all. A soldier who'd laughed at the phantom name during muster, calling it a glitch loud enough for the whole yard to hear, was gone from his bunk 2 days later. Not just absent, but erased. His belongings cleared, his name pulled from the active roster, as though a clerical hand had reached in and quietly tidied him away. Okonkwo started keeping her own list after that, a private ledger of names she was certain had been real, cross-checked against a roster that seemed to shift a little more each week. And every morning, the muster added one more name from that long-dead company, always in its correct alphabetical place, always answered present, by a voice that sounded a little more solid, a little less like static, each time. She understood, eventually, what was happening, though understanding it did nothing to help her stop it. The base wasn't malfunctioning. It was being filled, one name at a time, one vanished soldier at a time, by a company that had been wiped out on this ground and had never, in all the decades since, finished its own final roll call. Every soldier it took didn't disappear. They were reassigned, folded quietly into ranks that existed just slightly out of step with the living base around them, until the dead company was whole again. Okonkwo requested transfer 3 times. All 3 were denied without explanation, the kind of denial that arrives from a desk that doesn't need to justify itself. She stopped sleeping well. She stopped mocking the extra name during muster, out of a fear she couldn't fully articulate, even to herself, and instead started quietly, privately watching the roster each morning to see whose name had been added. On the final muster of her posting, the automated voice moved through the alphabet in its usual flat cadence, reached her name in its proper place, and paused, just slightly longer than it should have, before calling it. Okonkwo felt her own mouth open, felt the word leave her before she decided to say it, heard her own voice answer present into the quiet morning yard exactly the way the others had. And it was only in that moment, with the word already spoken and hanging in the cold air, that she understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late to matter, that she had died on this exact ground months ago, on a night she could no longer quite remember, and that everything since, every morning, every muster, every quiet, mounting fear, had simply been the company's memory of its last living day, replayed once more, with one more face folded gently into the ranks.
If you enjoyed the story, please like and subscribe.